Welcome to the Indian Gaming Association's The New Normal webcast. My name is Lisa Johnson. I'm the conference manager for the Indian Gaming Trade Show and Convention. I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips before we get started. Everyone is muted by default except for our speakers. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question or chat box, and they'll be brought up at the end. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Victor Rocha, conference chairman of the Indian Gaming Association.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the New Normal, your go-to source for insightful discussions on the gaming industry and critical issues affecting Native American tribes across the United States. I'm Victor Rocha. I'm the conference chairman for the Indian Gaming Association. My co-host is Jason Giles, the executive director of the Indian Gaming Association and former West Point football player too. So he's a big deal. We're very fortunate to have on today's, we're talking to our friend Tuari Bigknife. He's the Attorney General for the Viejas band of Kumeyaay Indians in Southern California, right out San Diego. And we're going to be talking about an issue that I've been wanting to get to for a while, which is, depending on who you're talking to, the California poker wars, tribes versus poker rooms. Tuari, how does it define for you at night when you're having the sweats and you can't sleep? Is it California poker wars? What is it for you, man?
Oh, well, thanks for letting me speak today. It has been a journey. 14 years of fighting this issue. It seems like it's probably been about as big a battle as there's been in gaming, at least in the last 2 decades, for California tribes. And it's specifically related to the card rooms and the banking card games that they're operating right now and have been for over a decade in violation of our constitutional exclusive rights. California has provided those rights to California tribes exclusively. And so we've been trying to get access to the courts, access to justice to protect and defend those rights.
Well, and fair disclosure, believe it or not, I have a little bit of a tiny role in this whole thing, about, and let me explain my role. And I think that kind of will get to the root of this. And by the way, I know as a host, you're supposed to interject yourself into every question and every, that's the egomaniac in me. But honestly, oh gosh, how long does this start? Are we talking when this happened with Lytle? How long was that? That's over 10 years ago.
That was
sure.
December of 2007 that Lytle issued that memo, though I don't think we were really aware of it for a few years after that.
Yeah, well, what happened was I got a phone call from Dave Palermo, and Dave Palermo was this legendary gaming writer. For those of you who don't know, he used to work part-time for me. He worked with a lot of other people in Pachanga.net. And, Dave Palermo his job was he would sit and listen to the recordings of the regulators, the California Gambling Control Commission. And on this particular meeting, he heard them talking about licensing the card clubs and this banking issue. And they talked about it, they discussed it, and the only person that opposed it at the time was Richard Schutz. And Richard was asking questions while you're doing it, and they just rubber stamped it. And then the very next day, Robert Lytle resigned, and he went into private practice as a consultant working for the card clubs. And Palermo was outraged that he saw this as a reporter. And, Dave Palermo used to work for the LA Times, he's an old newspaper guy, and in the best sense of the word. He was covering the California Night Stalker and stuff like that. So he's a real journalist. And for him, he sensed there was something wrong here. And so he wrote this article about why are they changing the rules and why is this guy resigning? And nobody would touch it. He was working for Gambling Compliance at the time, and they said, you know what, we don't want to touch this article. So he came to me at Pachanga.net, and I said, yeah, I'll post it, and of course we did. And Greg Moran from the San Diego Union Tribune ended up writing an article, basically the same thing that Palermo did, and that kind of just blew it up. It exploded, and I was right in the middle of this, but it was just us doing our jobs, and when we saw that this was very irregular, and it wasn't what we were used to seeing. It was interesting because now Richard's big thing has always been about regulators and being captured, and I think he talks about this from an insider's point of view. And this was a case of the California Gambling Commission leaning on the side of the card clubs against the tribes, doing everything they could to give the card clubs a chance or opportunities against the tribe, legal, illegal, whatever. But this was a case where
What
they
year was
changed the
this?
rules, 2007.
Okay.
2007. So that was my role in the very beginning of this thing. So I've watched this thing since 2007. And listen, it would happen. The chairman of the Gambling Control Commission resigned. The executive director was demoted. She was a California government employee, and she was demoted. So it created a big stink, but yet this is a continuation of that conversation, isn't it, Tuari?
It is, you know, and David was a huge, well, I always call him Dave, I guess. He was a huge
David.
for bringing this so out to the public, and making everybody aware of what was going on. He was a tremendous advocate, and I'm sure he's smiling down on us right now and the effort that we're doing in SB 549, finally bringing this to the end. And for the viewers, you know, the Lytle memo, is what we commonly refer to it as. It was a December 2007 letter. Robert Lytle at that time was the bureau chief, the Bureau of Gambling Control, and he issued a letter to two different lobbyists that represented card rooms. And in that letter, he talked about a very fundamental feature that differentiates card room gaming from the banked or banking card games that were allowed to operate in California. And the best way to distinguish that is if you go into a tribal casino, there is a bank and a dealer that operates as one and the same, right? So they take all bets, they play the dealer's hand, and they occupy that position throughout games. At card clubs, what they're supposed to do, and I'll use card clubs and card rooms interchangeably, mean the same thing. They are supposed to rotate the player-dealer position. And the purpose of rotating the player-dealer position is to make sure that nobody is able to be the bank by occupying that position the whole time. So what Robert Lytle suggested in his letter to those card room lobbyists is that you don't actually have to rotate the bank, you just have to offer to rotate it. And the players, of course, would not accept the bank. And so you get exactly what we have right now at the card rooms. You have this entity called a third-party prop player who's not an employee of the card room, but that entity has a contract with the card room. And that entity, the TPP, as we call it, they bank the game the entire time. So if you were to walk into a California card room right now, you would see this individual sitting there with a stack of chips, and they would be banking the game and occupying no other role. And then what you have is you have the card room employee, the dealer, who actually plays the hand of dealing the cards and making the decisions, for example, on a game of blackjack. And so those two positions that are the same in a tribal casino have just simply been split into two individuals. And then the amounts wagered, the amounts won and lost based on how those games play out, they then get funneled back to the card rooms through these lucrative contracts that the TPPs have with the card rooms. And so that is the complicated yet so obvious when you look at it mechanism of how these card rooms have been able to flaunt the law for over a decade.
Now, because of this, the tribes are saying this cuts into their exclusive rights for certain types of gambling. So this banking thing, right? How does this violate the tribes' rights?
Yeah, great question. So when Prop 1A was passed, tribes in California were given certain exclusive rights, slot machines, for example, right? One of the other categories was banking card games, right? So it's a banked game that utilizes cards. So the most common ones that we would think of, at least in terms of the revenue that they generate, would be blackjack and baccarat. Those are the two most popular ones in tribal casinos in California. And those are the two games that the card rooms are now playing with this division of the third-party bank or the third-party player and the card room. And so the way that they're violating the exclusivity that tribes have is our Constitution in California prohibits all forms of gaming other than what it allows. And it allows tribes under their gaming compacts to operate these games. It doesn't provide an exception for card clubs to do this. It doesn't provide an exception for anyone to engage in these games. Only tribes on their Indian lands subject to a gaming compact. And so much like, let's take Apple and talk about the iPhone technology, right? They have a patent on their iPhone technology. And so they have the exclusive rights to that technology that's in their iPhone. And so if somebody like myself was to create the X phone and use their intellectual property, they would be able to sue and stop me because they have exclusive protected rights to that. Well, the same analogy applies here. Tribes have the exclusive right to operate these banking card games. Card rooms are violating that exclusivity, and we have been trying for over a decade to get that issue resolved. We've tried to go in front of the regulators. We've tried to go in front of the legislature to work on, compromise language. We've been through 3 attorneys general on this issue. We've spoken with the governors, and we actually went to litigation a few years back, both bringing compact lawsuit, as well as a couple tribes that brought unfair business practices claims, which is a statute in California that if someone's engaged in illegal activity that impacts you, you can seek an injunction to stop that activity. And in each of those cases, tribes were kicked out of court on procedural grounds with this crazy outcome that the courts delivered of tribes having these rights, but having no ability to enforce them in the courts. So SB 549 is the legislative solution to this problem. It gives tribes a one-time access to the courts to challenge these games, to get clear direction from the courts on what California law, the California Constitution provides, and gives us the opportunity to go and argue that our exclusivity is being violated and to enjoin, ultimately, the card rooms from engaging in this activity anymore, which I can tell you, why does it matter for tribes? Not only is it just another promise that we would like kept among many broken promises, but this is also substantial revenue for each tribe up and down the state that we all know gaming provides to tribes so that we can have self-sufficiency, so we can provide those important government services to our people. It's the lifeblood for a tribe like Viejas to be able to take care of its people and run its government. And so that revenue is very important to us, and we would like to start getting it back because that's what the California voters granted to us.
So,
go ahead.
going
Jason.
back real quick, where have the California attorney generals been? Why did you need legislation for this?
There's a couple reasons. I think number one, there was a perception by certain attorney generals, because they had approved game rules, that if you read them by the letter, they're probably, most of them would be legal, right? Because they require game rotation every 2 hands, citing to a published opinion called the Oliver decision. But that decision was dicta, so it didn't actually bind anyone. And so all these game rules that had been submitted and approved by the Bureau of Gambling Control, which the AG oversees, I think that there was a little bit of concern about, hey, we approve these rules, the card rooms are going to try to blame us. But at the end of the day, the card rooms aren't even complying with their own game rules. And the game rules don't trump, for any lawyers on the call, they don't trump law, nor do they trump the Constitution. So we're trying to get in from that direction. The second part is that the AGs did try to address this issue in the way that they felt they had the power to, and that was through the regulatory process. Now, they never actually started the regulatory process. What they did was they held hearings and they conducted, informal concept regulatory workshops. And during those workshops, there was discussion about blackjack games and the intent of the Bureau to shut down those games. And there was also discussion about that game rotation standard, the player-dealer rotation, and how often that needed to happen in order to comply with the law that requires, it's a Penal Code 330.11, that requires that rotation and to make sure that a game is not a banked game. And so what happened was the AG's office, the Bureau of Gambling Control, was met with very strong resistance by the card clubs each time. AG Harris, now a candidate for president, she had proposed or issued a notification related to that game rotation standard. The card rooms pushed that notification over to the Office of the Administrative Law in California, and they were able to get a decision by that department that the Bureau lacked the authority to move forward with that notification on game rotation because it was a, quote, underground regulation. So move on to AG Becerra, who followed her. He attempted to push some concept language forward that would deal with the blackjack games and would have revoked the rules that approved a lot of those games that the card rooms are illegally operating as blackjack. He was met with a bunch of letters, one in particular that I recall from a big law firm in LA that represents the California Gambling Association, which is the card room's largest trade organization. And those attorneys argued that the Attorney General and the Bureau of Gambling Control lacked the authority to pass those regulations. And so it was very clear that they were threatening to gum up the courts, even if the AG's office went through the lengthy regulatory process, went through the expensive analysis on the financial impacts, that they were still going to challenge that authority. And then if we move forward to the current AG, Bonta, he also issued some concept language. It's very similar to what AG Harris did for the rotation. It's very similar to what AG Becerra did for the blackjack. And he was met with the same resistance again. So in our conversations, and we've certainly met with the AG, as has a bunch of other tribes, our request is let's move forward with our legislation. This is the quickest way to the finish line. This gives the Attorney General the definitive legal interpretation that his or future AG's offices can benefit from, that will just put this issue to bed and resolve it once and for all.
Well, you said I noticed in a number of the articles, you're getting local politicians are seeing them become more involved, the mayors, county commissioners. It looks like that this bill could be sparking a new round of fights in another arena, not necessarily the administrative legal one, but now we're doing public policy and lobbying. What do you think the chances are of moving this and getting tribes in a position to protect their rights is what it really comes down to?
Well, we feel very confident that this is going to pass. As you can see by the screen behind me, I have the assembly floor on. We're expecting our bill to go this week on the assembly floor. It then needs to go over to the Senate. Session ends here in California this Saturday. So our opportunity to get this bill through the legislature and on the governor's desk ends on Saturday. So we have teams of lobbyists, tribal leaders, and a bunch of legislators that are also strongly in support of this, that are working tirelessly to get this thing across the finish line. There has been, a lot of legislative leadership, Senator Josh Newman is the author of the bill and has just been an outstanding advocate for Indian country on this issue. And we also have leaders such as the past pro tem, Senator Tony Atkins, who has made this personal for her and is a very important issue for her, as well as folks on the assembly side. Take the majority leader, for example, Assemblywoman Cecilia Aguiar Curry. This is also a big issue for her. You also see other leaderships, other leaders, names on the bill. We have, I believe, over 20 legislators that have already signed on just as authors, co-authors, whatever the terminology is that they use. They're people that are out there fighting for this bill and are strongly in support. In addition, you cannot understate what tribal leadership has done up and down the state to move this bill forward. That has been the strongest and the most important voice in getting this done, getting this to where it is. The last legislation that any of us that can remember, back a couple decades, was the Senate constitutional amendment that actually put Prop 1A on the ballot. And you had, support, widespread support up and down the state of California among tribal nations. You have the same thing for SB 549, literally the biggest group of tribes fighting in the same direction on the same issue. And so that's really what's made a difference. And at the end of the day, I think the narrative of what we're really fighting for here, it should be a no-brainer, right? If we were talking about any group being denied their right to access the court to protect their rights, just take away the labels of who the infringer is and who the party is that deserves to be protected, I think everybody would say, of course they deserve access to the courts. That's just a fundamental thing. But for some reason, tribes, and I know the tribal leaders know this better than anyone, we just always have to fight harder than everyone else to protect things that should be no-brainers.
Chris Cerroti, our good friend, asked a really relevant question. He goes, what are your options if SB 549 doesn't pass this session? It is close to passage, but are there any potential roadblocks in the legislature's final days? As you say, it ends on Saturday.
So the first question that I'll address is really, are there roadblocks? The card rooms are spending a ton of money. They are fighting as hard as they can against this. My interpretation of why they are doing that is because they believe they're going to lose in court, which I also personally believe they will lose in court. And so that's why they're using the arguments, not on the merits, but instead taking that old, I almost call it a disgraceful ploy. It at least is to me. They're causing a lot of fear in their employees. They're causing a lot of fear to cities by suggesting that the purpose of our bill is to shut them down, that the purpose of our bill is to put people out of work, to put police departments out of operation, to eliminate fire departments, and nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, the revenue that these card rooms are generating that should be going to tribes, it's kind of ironic because that revenue would be going to support the same things for our tribal nations. But the fact that they're being deceitful in neglecting is that the card rooms operated before they did this. They operated before the Lytle letter. They provided money to cities before the Lytle letter. They employed people before the Lytle letter. And they are able to continue doing that. They just shouldn't be doing that on the back of violating our exclusive rights. So that means they need to innovate. They need to go back to what they used to do and operate legally within the law. And that's the only outcome that this case could generate. If there is a lawsuit and SB 549 passes, any legal game that the card rooms are operating is going to continue. And if that game is illegal, well, I think everybody agrees it should be shut down. If we're not a country for following the law, what are we? Turning to the other, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Finish.
Turning to the other question, right, which is what happens next? Well, the reality is, as we've told the legislators, this can be the first time you vote on this bill, or excuse me, it can be the last time you vote on this bill, or it can just be the first time, right? And from our perspective, we're just going to keep coming back until we get our access to justice, because, you know, what's right is on our side here.
Well, you know, it's been a long battle, you know what I mean? And you know, one of the things that's always been very interesting to me is that, you know, if you really look at it, it is the card clubs have brought in the cities, the city workers, and you know they do their protests. Cal Matters just had a really great article a couple weeks ago about this issue, and they talked about the unions and the protests and going after one of the co-sponsors of the bill. So you know the strategies are very common. You see them dust off the same plan, they pull it off the shelf, take the dust off, and you know we're immediately going to push the poor city workers in front of the cameras. You know what I mean? Yet in the meantime, you know, they know everything they did. You know, it's just this is what the tribes have to deal with. You know, when you were talking, the first thing that came to my mind was the Treaty of Temecula. You know what I mean? Which is that kind of shapes how I see things in government and tribal to government relationships. And what this is was with my tribe, and you know the landowners coming and pushing my tribe off the land, and my tribe seeking redress, and the legislature doing this treaty and then just sticking it in a drawer and never ratifying it. You know what I mean? And it always, that seems to be the case with governments, where they'll go up to a certain point and then the tribes are just given lip service and then nothing happens. And so, you know, I was surprised that you guys got SB 549 moving at all. It's been a really tough path, I assume. What has surprised you about this, about moving this bill? Has it been new partners? Has it been new enemies?
Well, I guess probably the most surprising part for me personally has been the civics lesson in California politics and movement of a bill, and things that you don't learn in law school, you don't learn in school anywhere. The I guess really kind of the strategy and the timing of things, the challenges that you don't necessarily expect that you're going to have to overcome, and the importance of, and you know, maybe this is, I think this is probably an unfair thing, but you know, if a few tribes are asking for something, even if it's 100% the right thing, it seems that we have to get all tribes on board, or pretty close to all tribes. And so we had to really do a lot of work to generate that tribal support, to make sure that tribes were aware of the issue, because some aren't in cardroom areas, some aren't impacted as directly as other tribes. Yet the California legislature really wants to know that all tribes are on board. So there was a lot of effort by the tribal leadership to get that coalition as large and as strong as it is. And I was very surprised that that was necessary. I thought that a few tribes, because of the righteousness of what we were doing, were going to be able to push this through a little bit easier. I think the other surprises have really focused on the gamesmanship that the card rooms have been playing. And I'm reminded of a quote I've heard, maybe you've heard it before, that, you know, lies travel halfway around the world while the truth is still tying its shoes. And I found that we were constantly having to spend time combating against the lies that the card rooms were telling. And you've probably seen, you know, myth fact sheets or things like that, you know, the PC way of putting it out there. No, what we shared is lies and truth, card room lies and the truth. And so we've been countering so many of these arguments that they've been presenting that are just bald-faced lies that aren't in the bill anywhere, but we spend an inordinate amount of time having to address those lies, rather than the straightforward argument of, hey, we have these exclusive rights. don't we deserve access to the court to enforce it? Which again, you'd think would be a no-brainer. But that's the process. Legislators have to do their job. They have to take and analyze those arguments and those points raised by the card rooms, even if their instincts tell them that they're garbage. They still have to do their job, and we have to do ours in responding to them.
What message do you want to send to the legislators who might still be undecided about 549? You know, one of the things in the Cal Matters articles is that they're using, the card clubs are using the process. They're protesting legislators outside their office and stuff like that. What message would you like to send to the legislators that are still undecided on the issue?
Yeah, I think the most important message is that we really tailored this legislation to be as easy to pass as possible. And what I mean by that is the legislation simply sends this dispute, this issue that has been permeating around Sacramento and really around California for over 14 years. It sends it to the court to interpret California law and tribal gaming exclusivity. And the answer to that question is going to aid everything going forward. This legislation does nothing more than that. It provides one opportunity for a lawsuit. All cases have to be consolidated into one case. It will, if it goes through the appellate process, it will be one appeal all the way through the Supreme Court, and we will have a definitive decision. We did nothing in the bill to stack anything in our favor or the other side's favor. And there's been an argument thrown out there by the card rooms that somehow having a de novo review standard by the judge is somehow the tribes trying to create an advantage for them in the lawsuit. And again, nothing could be further from the truth. They're just playing with Latin terms that we learn in law school. That happen to just reflect the normal reality. If you go in front of a judge and you ask a judge to interpret a question of law in a California court, or you ask the judge to apply law to a certain set of facts in a California court, they do that de novo. They don't call it de novo because de novo is really an appellate standard, but they do that analysis independently, which is what de novo means. No deference given, independent review. And so what we would ask is, that you stand by tribes, that you stand for our access to justice here, and that you recognize that this is a solution that puts this to bed. Nobody's going to come knocking on any legislator's door. And really what we think is, supporting this bill, voting in favor of this bill is doing the right thing. It's honoring the vote that California voters made in support of tribal exclusive gaming. And what it is also doing, it is giving the card rooms and the third-party providers every fair chance to go into court and to prove what they're doing is legal. And as I've said many times before, if what the card rooms are doing is legal, they should relish the opportunity to go in court and to prove it and to quiet tribes once and for all.
What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, this is it really is a fascinating exercise in state politics on an issue that frankly is unique in the sense that, it falls between the cracks of administrative, judicial, and then just pure political avenues here. And I know the tribes have been fighting this for a long time. Go back real quick to the monetary impacts. I mean, is that something that the tribes are going to be able to show to a judge, because these certain games exist? How are you going to show like those people would otherwise be at a casino playing blackjack, but they're over at a card room playing this, illegal form of blackjack? And what would be left of the card rooms if they got rid of, if a judge ultimately struck down some of this? The card rooms would revert back to what they were originally, which was what, just a poker playing area?
Sure. Well, two great questions. You must be a lawyer.
Yeah.
So,
Mine are
first
about
question-
myself.
So the first question really focusing in on how do we prove our case? And I think one piece of good news is, we have these exclusive rights. Whether we've been damaged or not, and to what extent we've been damaged, is actually not an element of the case that we'll have to prove or submit any evidence to support. But that normally you have to do that in a case. But we're not trying to get any damages out of this case. We're just trying to get injunctive relief based on the interpretation of California law. And so I think the impact on the card rooms that would happen, right, is if they lose, this is going to result in some of their games getting shut down. That doesn't stop them from innovating, putting new games out there that are legal. It also doesn't stop them from following what the game rules, require, which is rotation of the player dealer position. They can do that. That's what they used to do. And so there's a fundamental difference in the way that card rooms earn their revenue right now versus the way they traditionally did. And that difference is card rooms now get revenue from the third-party banks under those very lucrative contracts that I was talking about. I've never actually been able to view a contract. The state does not release those for review, despite repeated requests that tribes have made. But under those contracts, we have been told, based on some regulatory workshops that took place in the CGCC, that there's a whole list of categories of advertising, office space, valet parking, and the list goes on, utilities, and the list goes on and on. And I think that they are probably, well, not probably, we know that they are paying rates that probably would shame the most expensive, condo in New York City. Just outrageous dollars. And why do we know this? Because those outrageous dollars form the basis for revenue that they then transfer over to the cities, right, in the form of taxes. So what card rooms could do is they could go right back to charging what's called a collection fee. And that's the way they traditionally earn their revenue. And the collection fee is a fee that you would pay every hand if you were a player. And it's very similar, right? It derives from what happens in poker, right? Poker, we have the rake, and that's how the operator of a poker game gets paid, is through the rake. You'd have that same collection fee, that rent payment, that would be made to the card club by the patrons that are playing those games. So those are really the opportunities. We're not moved by the fact that they don't have the opportunity to go out there and innovate and find other ways to be creative and make revenue, nor do we really find ourselves very persuaded by the argument that an entity, these card rooms have been in existence for over 100 years. They've only been doing this illegal gaming, since 2007. So there's no reason to believe that they can't go back to being successful operations without, walking on the back of tribes and taking our rights.
I have a two-parter question. First of all, how does this affect gameplay with the poker clubs? And is it going to be much harder to launder dirty money with this? I mean, it's got to be much more difficult now, right?
Yeah, well, you raise a great point, right? The card clubs in California, they have a
Reputation,
it's
history.
I'm just
Numbers
thinking
don't lie. You can't lie about the numbers.
all the
you know what I mean?
headlines. Yeah, the headlines of the outrageous fines they've paid. And it's amazing, right? They allow the money laundering. They've allowed the money laundering to take place.
And they all have licenses and they come back, and the same thing that would not be allowed in tribal gaming. And you know what? Gene has a question here, and I'm sorry to do it because I'm getting mad. But Gene, says, would reforming the current bifurcated regulatory system in California, would that provide any situation? And, Richard Schutz talks about regulatory capture. And if this isn't, I mean, I've seen hostage videos with more freedom than the California Gaming Commission,
I do think that it's a strange, the California regulatory system and the way it handles gaming is somewhat odd. Where you have the California Gambling Control Commission, odd. They have a certain level of jurisdiction and oversight. They report to the governor. And then you have the Bureau of Gambling Control, which is the enforcement arm. They report to the Attorney General. But there's overlap, possibly some gaps between the two agencies in terms of how these issues. I'll just take like a card room contract, for example. Like the Bureau is involved in the review of these contracts between the TPPs, the third-party banks, and the card rooms, but then it goes to the California Gambling Control Commission for approval. And therein lies kind of why we can't really get our arms entirely wrapped around the situation. Because the California Gambling Control Commission, kind of promulgates what's supposed to be in there. Or you take an issue like advertising. That was one of the arguments that A.G. Harris had made, is, well, if these card rooms claim they're not operating blackjack games, and they're saying they're operating blackjack, then that has to be false advertising. So the California Gambling Control Commission should do something about that. So you have this interesting situation where false advertising apparently isn't something that gets addressed by the enforcement body, the Bureau of Gambling Control, but instead has to go in front of the regulatory body, the California Gambling Control Commission. And I could go on and on about those types of challenges. So I think Gene's question is well placed, but obviously our focus right now isn't on fixing any of those issues, but instead, making sure that tribes have their access to justice.
Wow, there's a lot there.
Yeah, Scott pointed out some, good information there on how tribes have been deprived of governmental revenue. And apparently the California Gaming Association is just proud to claim that the games generate $2 billion a year. So, they can't hide everything, I guess. So
that's right. And you had asked a question earlier too, just about the impact on tribes. If I could talk a little bit about that, we've probably, in looking at projects and having feasibility studies done, right? We bring in these economists and they suggest to us, well, if you do this, it can generate this amount of revenue. That really was the basis for which tribes were making arguments before about the revenue impacts, because it's very difficult when you're looking at the metrics of gaming and your revenues and how things are being generated to really isolate the variables in a way that you can say, all right, this is what the card rooms are taking away from us. But this is where the good old virus from China or wherever it came from, right, helps us out. It really helped us out in one way. It helped us because the card rooms were shut down for 14 months. And during those 14 months, our table games revenue, specifically our blackjack and our baccarat revenue, increased tremendously. And so what we were able to do is, by the power of COVID and I guess the folks that kept the card room shut down for 14 months, we were finally able to isolate that variable and measure the impact. And so we've conservatively said, and this is just based on information that has been shared with us confidentially by a couple tribes. And as you know, tribes like to keep their government revenue confidential, but it is well over $100 million a year impact that this is causing. And that's not even including some of the tribes that we know are most impacted by the biggest card rooms. So Scott's number, I don't know if it's 2 billion, but it's a huge number, and it's a number that could benefit every single one of our tribal governments, because I don't know a tribe in California and probably the country that couldn't use more money to provide more services and programs to their people and take care of their government the way they want to. You know, it'll never reach the point of truly compensating for what was taken away from us, but it's important that we at least be able to hold on to everything that's ours now.
Wow. Well, thanks, Tuari. You know, we have a couple more questions, and then we'll go if you guys have some questions and the guests. First of all, Tuari, thanks so much, because it's such a fascinating issue, and it's not straightforward or linear, and it's just so many variables, and this is something that's been going on forever too. And I think at the root of this issue, not trying to jump, but if you look at, I mean, how can we have sports betting in California when we can't even regulate poker clubs? You know what I mean? How can we can't even deal with money laundering, and every time we hear the card clubs, it's another money laundering story and another banking story and another corruption story again and again and again. And these people are relicensed again and again. You know what I mean? And one of the things that you didn't mention was the fact that even Jerry Brown, when he was Attorney General, he just sat on it. And a lot of this comes in, and that's when people say, well, why didn't you deal with it a long time ago? Well, when you have people like Jerry Brown, who was Attorney General, and he just sat on it. And then when he was governor, he sat on it, and then left in disgrace to some of us, who are actually paying attention, So, this has just been a long, long issue, and it isn't that you guys are spoiled sports. This is something that you guys have been pushing for a really long time, and saying, look, this is an issue that does not just affect us, but affects everyone. Jill Dorson has a good question here. She says, you said you would continue to go back to the legislature if 549 doesn't pass. Could you go to the voters if this doesn't pass? Would you put it now? You attached it to the sports betting bill, Prop 26. Prop 26 didn't pass, but there was a lot of talk about that. A lot of tribes felt like, well, maybe this shouldn't be on this. What kind of pushbacks do you get from the tribes?
Okay, so I mean, one, to be clear, Prop 26 did have some language to address the card room issue. SB 549 is very different from that. And we learned some of the lessons from concerns that were raised about that language. I don't believe that is why Prop 26 failed. Voter confusion between Prop 27 and 26 was a big part of what created a problem there. And additionally, based on the polling that we've seen, California voters' views on sports wagering just weren't ready to authorize it yet. And probably for some of the reasons that you stated, though I definitely want to add, especially if we have any of those folks on the call, our tribal regulators do a great job. They have done a great job. We don't have those headlines attached to our gaming, even though ironically that was what everyone was using to try to prevent us from getting into the gaming space to begin with.
Irony of ironies, yeah.
Yeah, but we've done an outstanding job, and there's no reason to believe that tribes wouldn't be capable of handling sports wagering within their tribal casinos in the near future. We've demonstrated that we have the ability to regulate gaming. But your points about the state and having to create another system when there's even struggles within the current system and regulating the card rooms, that's a point well taken. So kind of took myself astray. Can you remind me of the other portion of that question? I'll answer that.
I'm just asking about wanting to know the support you have from other tribes. Do you get any pushbacks? What's the relationship with the other tribes? And this is not necessarily a Viejas issue, by the way, but you guys have taken point on it.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely not a Viejas issue. This is supported by over 70 tribes, supported by CNIGA, supported by TASIN, supported by CTBA. I'll also throw in the fact that we have a lot of unions, and I think if you actually did the math on adding up actual union members that work in tribal casinos in California versus those that work in card clubs, which is an infinitesimally small number, we actually have more of labor in support of us. We also have some very large labor unions that have supported SB 549 and tribal access to justice. So, the fact that there are these unions representing some city workers that are buying the disaster scenario that the card rooms have sold them. You know, again, shame on the card rooms for pushing that false narrative out there. But understand the labor support is on our side as well. Tribes are in lockstep on this. Like I said, I've heard tribal leaders say this, that we're on the battle lines, you know, when they were doing Prop 5 and Prop 1A, and they said this is as large a coalition as we had then, and that's saying something for California tribes on a gaming issue.
Awesome.
Well, so much here. Jason, what do you
Yeah.
think, man? How's your head?
Yeah, I mean,
spinning?
Tori, thank you for your time. I know you got the legislature on right behind you, and
Right.
you know, we're cheering for you, because this it's hard to apply this in context to a place like Wisconsin, where they have issues with tavern owners and some of the other places where illegal gambling occurs.
Minnesota and pool tabs that expanded beyond its initial, you know, all of a sudden one little thing becomes a massive issue, and then, you know, it's the same reply, you know what I mean, the same response. Well, look at, we're creating, all this money is going to crippled kittens, you know what I mean, and so you're, all the crippled kittens aren't going to be able to do it. They did it in you know, it reminds me, and Tori, you were around when VGT was trying to push class 2 games with the charities, you know what I mean, and they came in, and next, you know, they came in with the Catholic charities, and they brought in the poor and the poor people, the handicapped people who, with this money, were the end victims of this thing. I remember after the Catholic Church pulled out and everyone pulled out, and all these people that were advocates for the handicaps, their heads were spinning. They're like, we don't know what just happened. Thought this was going to be easy money and stuff like that. So, you know, this is the modus operandi for the industry, is just push out a crippled kitten. And, you know, this is, you know, so, again, you know, we're going to give you the last word. Are there any misconceptions you would like to clear up before we
well, I do want to respond, you know, that's an interesting observation you made about the video lottery terminals as well. You know, we were one of the tribes that worked with several others to get that taken care of. And ironically, you know, the way that the relationship of tribes and the state of California has changed with respect to compacts. Remember the 04 compacts and the governor, you know, saying the tribes are going to share, right? We had a lot of financial juice in those 04 compacts and the compacts that came afterward, in terms of general fund payments that the state was counting on. And so that gave some leverage to raise the hand and say, hey, if you don't shut down those VLT devices, the video lottery terminal devices, which we believe violates the Constitution and our exclusivity, we're going to stop paying money into the general fund. Well, surprise, surprise, that got a response. But the way compacts have changed over time, to where the state is getting nothing other than some regulatory fees, and perhaps even more in regulatory fees than it should be. The financial benefit going to the state isn't really there anymore, and that took away our leverage and really forced this process. Whereas I think, you know, had we known about it, you know, right after the 04 compacts or right around the time of the Lido letter, we probably would have had leverage to deal with it quicker.
You know, let me do an anecdote about this, which is still one of my favorite stories about this, is that when we were in full swing, you know, and also the Catholic Church was involved. And I remember we were like, oh my God, we have to fight the Catholic Church again, by the way. And they went after the Catholic Church. People were like going, you know what? The Catholic Church is involved in gaming because they just want this money so that they can pay the victims of sexual abuse. And the Catholic Church was like, we're out. They tapped out so fast, man. And it was just, everyone was like, they were gone. They wanted no part of that thing. And it was just that VGT on one side and these advocates for the handicap, and that thing just dissipated real quick. But my point there is that, you know, they're always going to do that. They're always looking for the, you know, a crack in the armor. You know what I mean? So again, Vegas, Catholic Church, sports betting, bring them on. We fight them all. Sultan Brunei, bring them on. Elon, bring them. You know what I mean? This is California. So, Tuari, thank you so much. What a fascinating conversation. I apologize about interjecting myself into this conversation, but that's what I do. You know what I mean? So, we really appreciate it, everyone.
Yeah.
Jason, do you want to wrap it up? You want to
Yeah.
then?
We're, you know, as California goes, so goes the nation pretty much, you know, what is it? 6th largest economy in the world at this point. And
Yeah,
you know,
5.
5th largest. Okay.
Yeah,
And,
I checked.
you know, so we'll keep an eye on this. Obviously the California tribes are, you know, the biggest gambling market in America. So, you know, everything hinges on them staying united and working with this legislature. So, which seems to be happening. So we'll hope for a good outcome this week.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
I really appreciate Victor and Jason. You giving me the opportunity to be here today and share this with everyone. And you know, as I was told early in my career in Indian gaming, you know, we have these gaming rights, but we're going to have to continuously and vigilantly fight to defend them. And I appreciate all the work that you guys do in that effort, because this is the opportunity for tribes to continue, you know, with the funding their governments and taking care of their people the way they should be able to. And it's opened the door to be able to expand into other realms of revenue. And so we'll continue doing everything we need to do here in California to protect those rights and of course to support those other tribes around the nation in their efforts. So thank you very much.
I would like to point out the NPC right behind Tuari. So keep making those beats. And next week we're gonna have Carlton Safa from Saracen talking about their was it a sweepstakes or raffle and sports betting and CIL, and it's going to be fascinating. I can't wait to see it. So again, thank you, Tuari. We really appreciate it. We'd like to thank everyone who stuck with us, and we'll see you guys next week. Jason, thank you so much. Thanks,
Tuari.
everybody. See you guys next week.
you.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.